The oldest known grave on Earth is 130,000 years old. It belongs to a Neanderthal child. The body was not left in the open, not abandoned, not discarded. Someone carried it to a specific place, dug into the earth with their hands, and laid it down carefully. These were people with no writing, no religion as we define it, no philosophy, no language complex enough to discuss what death even meant. And yet they buried their dead, which means one of the most human things we do is not human at all. It is something older. In 1960, a paleoanthropologist named Ralph Solecki was excavating a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar. He had been digging there for years. Most of what he found was stone tools and compacted ash. Then he reached a grave, a Neanderthal male buried roughly 60,000 years ago. When he sent soil samples from around the body to a laboratory in Paris, the results came back unusual. The grave was saturated with pollen, not from wind drift, not from accidental contamination, from at least 8 distinct species of wildflowers, concentrated in dense clusters around where the body had been placed. Solecki's conclusion was quiet but devastating. Someone had gone out into the fields, picked flowers, carried them back to the cave, and laid them around someone they had lost 60,000 years ago. Later, researchers debated whether the pollen could have arrived by other means. The debate has never been fully settled, but the grave itself was not debated. The placement of the body was intentional, the positioning was deliberate, the care was real, and Shanidar was not an isolated case. Across Europe, across the Middle East, across Africa, archaeologists have now cataloged hundreds of intentional burials from before the emergence of modern human culture. Neanderthals burying their dead in the fetal position, bodies oriented toward the rising sun, grave goods, tools, animal bones, pigment, placed deliberately alongside the body. In Spain, a site called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, contained the skeletal remains of at least 28 individuals, all deposited in the same shaft deep inside a cave system. They had been carried there, one by one. The only object found with them was a single hand axe, crafted from deep red quartzite. It served no practical purpose in that context. It had been left for the dead. Archaeologist Juan Luis Arzuaga, who led the excavations, spent years trying to explain why a group of early humans with no symbolic language and no organized religion would go to that kind of effort. His conclusion was simple. They recognized that something had ended, and they responded to that recognition the same way every human culture since has responded to it. They did something, because doing nothing was unbearable. But what happened after the burial is where it gets stranger. Modern grief follows a shape: the funeral, the mourning period, the gradual return to normal life, the grave you can visit, the anniversary you observe. Hunter-gatherer grief did not follow that shape. Anthropologist Turnbull spent years living with the Mbuti pygmies of the Congo rainforest, one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth. When someone died in a Mbuti camp, the mourning was immediate, total, and brief. The entire camp would grieve loudly and completely for a short period, sometimes hours, sometimes a day. Then they moved, literally. They packed their belongings and relocated the camp to a new site, not because they were fleeing grief, because in a culture where every physical space is saturated with the presence of the people who occupied it, remaining in the place where someone died was its own form of torture. The Mbuti did not leave the dead behind. They left the place behind. The person traveled with them in a different form. Among the Hadza of Tanzania, the approach was different again. The Hadza bury their dead quickly, within hours of death. The grave is dug near the camp, the body placed inside in a flexed position, and the site is covered. Then it is not visited. Not because the dead are forgotten, but because the Hadza relationship with death is built on a concept that has no direct translation into English. Anthropologist Frank Marlowe, who studied the Hadza for decades, described it as something close to acceptance without detachment. The dead are gone from this world. Returning to the grave does not change that. What the living owe the dead is not visits, it is continuation. The Hadza grieve fully and without suppression. Then they hunt, they gather, they feed the children, they keep the camp alive. That is the memorial. What almost no ancient culture practiced was the extended, formalized, institutionalized grief architecture that modern societies have built. The preserved body, the open casket, the cemetery plot maintained for generations, the headstone with the dates. These are recent inventions, and some researchers who study grief psychology argue they may not be serving us as well as we assume. Psychologist George Bonanno at Columbia University spent decades studying how people actually recover from loss. His findings contradicted almost everything the grief counseling industry had built itself on. Most people, he found, do not move through defined stages of grief. Most people are resilient by default. They grieve sharply, then stabilize. What prolongs grief, Bonanno found, is not the loss itself. It is the expectation of how grief is supposed to look. The cultural script that tells you how long you should mourn, what you should feel, and when you should be over it. Hunter-gatherers had no such script. They had only the loss, the response, and the necessity of continuing. There is one more thing, something that cuts across almost every ancient burial ever excavated. The dead were not separated from the living. In many early human sites, the dead were buried beneath the floors of the shelters where the living slept, beneath the hearth, beneath the place where meals were prepared, beneath the ground where children played. The dead remained part of the household, not as a source of fear, as a form of presence. Archaeologist Kuijt, who has studied Neolithic burial practices extensively, argues that this proximity was deliberate and purposeful. The boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, it was a floor, and the people who walked on it every day knew exactly who was underneath. We have spent 10,000 years building distance between ourselves and death. We moved the dying to hospitals. We moved the dead to funeral homes. We moved the graves to designated zones at the edge of towns. We made death something that happens elsewhere, to someone else, managed by professionals, kept out of sight until the paperwork is done. And we did all of this believing we were being kind, believing we were protecting the living from unnecessary pain. But the oldest grave on Earth tells a different story. 130,000 years ago, someone knelt in the dirt and buried a child. No institution told them to. No religion required it. No social convention demanded it. They did it because the child had mattered, and the only way they knew how to say that was to place the body carefully in the ground and cover it with their hands. We have built an entire civilization since then. We have built hospitals and religions and grief counselors and cemetery maintenance schedules, and we still have not found a better answer to loss than the one those hands already knew.
Subscribe.